if we are to step back and say strength training and hypertrophy training is critical for people of all ages,
yeah,
for developing and maintaining the neuromuscular system and for our ability to function in the world,
yeah,
not just offset injury, but the ability to pick things up and move, et cetera. What are some of the other things that strength and hypertrophy training can provide? I know a lot of people use strength and hypertrophy training for changing their aesthetics.
Yeah.
What is your sense about its potency for changing aesthetics as compared to, say, cardiovascular exercise?
Yeah, the mantra I always like is, the reason you want to exercise is threefold, right? You want to look good, feel good, play good. That comes from sport, comes from football. Specifically, we always say that. And what that means really is you want to look good. People want to look the way they want to look, whatever that means to them. And there are any versions of what you feel to be aesthetically pleasing, and that's totally irrelevant. But people want to look the way they want to look. Number two, you want to be able to feel good. What's that mean? You want to be injury-free. You want to have energy throughout the day. You want to be able to execute anything you want to. So whether you want to go surf in the morning, you want to play racquetball, you want to hike, or you want to do all three of those in one day, you should have the ability to do that. And then you want to play good, which means you should be able to execute any activities that you want to execute, whatever that means. All right, so backing all up, what's that got to do with your question? One of the major benefits of strength training is the responses tend to happen extremely fast. So you can see noticeable changes in muscle size certainly within a month, absolutely within 6 weeks. And so we have this wonderful feedback loop that sort of tells you, am I doing this incorrectly? Oh my gosh, yes, I am. Also, it's very addicting. The feedback, the response, the physical changes, whether this is actually point 2 or 3, look good or feel good, play good, or it's even just part 1, you're starting to see that when you compare that to things like fat loss, that journey tends to be longer. It's more difficult. It's more reliant upon other factors like nutrition, etc. Strength training is really about there's some very minimal nutrition requirements. Outside of that, it comes down to the training, and the feedback is immediate. That's powerful because if you look across the literature on exercise adherence, you'll see that that is in fact the #1 predictor of effectiveness of any training program. So what that means is if you were to put any variable possible and figure out what is going to determine whether or not this program works, this is what we typically call the methods are many and the concepts are few. So the methods of exercise, the methods of strength training, the methods of hypertrophy training, which we'll talk about, are infinite. However, there are only a handful of key concepts that you have to achieve in order for that program to work. Adherence is one of them, and again, is often the top one. So you need to do something, you need to do something consistently. When you are getting that feedback and you're seeing results in your appearance immediately, and you see that every single day, every time you take off your shirt or every time you look in the mirror, you see that result, that tends to drive adherence really powerfully. So it's important to give people wins, especially people who are not maybe like you and I, who are like, I'm going to lift weights and I'm going to exercise no matter what the rest of my life because I just love it. Not everyone's like that. And so giving them a little bit of carrot of success, and if you can achieve that in, say 3 to 4 to 5 weeks already, it's a very powerful tool.
Okay, let's talk about hypertrophy, a topic that occupies the minds of so many youth, young men, but also a lot of women. I think one of the really interesting progressions that's taken place in the last decade or so is that far more men and women are using resistance training in order to evoke hypertrophy, growth of muscles, for aesthetic reasons and for all sorts of reasons. What are the ways that people can induce hypertrophy?
So not to correct you or insult you, but probably a better way to think about that question is really, what stimuli do I need to give the muscle to induce hypertrophy? Now, there are hormonal factors that are important, there are nutritional factors, but just to stick with the context of training, this is really going to frame a lot of our answers. And as you'll see, it's one of the reasons why I call hypertrophy training kind of idiot-proof in terms of programming. Now, the work is hard, difficult, and all that, but the precision needed is a lot less than what we saw in power and strength. And so if you note there, it's very important that you do it in this style, with this intent, and within these parameters. And if you're outside these parameters, it's not going to be it. Hypertrophy has a very broad range in terms of your actual applications. And this is why you have and will continue to see countless styles of training that all work. I mean, I know you were mentored earlier in life by one of my favorite people in this entire field, Mike Mentzer, just an absolute character. His style was completely different than what you would see in a classic textbook or any number of different influencers or coaches or individuals. And if you've ever thought to yourself, why is it all these programs work? And people love to jump to things like, well, it's the steroids. Just get that out of the equation for now. Independent of that, right? That's not even part of the equation. You're still going to see results. And the question is why? Well, that's because what's driving changes in strength and power are the adaptations of specificity. What's driving changes in hypertrophy is much more well-rounded. And so you have options to get there. Remember, you're training a movement, and now you're training a response in a muscle that causes growth. That's very, very different. So if we look at the classic dogma, we have to basically challenge the muscle to need to come back, in this case, specifically bigger, and the nutrients need to be there to support that growth. Okay, the nutrients aside, perhaps we can come in a few more minutes and talk about that. So all we really have to do is, going back to our dogma of activation of something on the cell wall. We've talked about this earlier. That's got to induce that signaling cascade. That's got to be strong enough to cause the nucleus to react to it, to go to the ribosomes, to initiate this entire cascade of protein synthesis. Okay, so that signal has to be one of a couple of things. Either it has to be strong enough one time, it has to be frequent enough, or it has to be a combination of these things. All right, so I can get there with a lot of frequency and a moderate signal. I can get there with very low frequency and a large signal, like more akin to what you did with Mike back in the day, I'm sure.
And still train that way.
Still train
each muscle group mainly once a week directly and once a week indirectly.
So all you have to do there to not fail is to make sure the training is hard enough, and it's going to work. If you choose the frequency path, then you actually have to make sure you're not training too hard to where you can't actually maintain the frequency. The only wrong combination here is infrequent and low intensity and low volume. That's it. As long as one of those three variables is high, you're going to get there, because the mechanisms that are needed to activate that signaling cascade are wide-ranging. And this is why when we even see things like blood flow restriction training, right? This is when you put like a cuff on your arm or your leg and you block blood flow and you use no load, or as low as say 30% of your maximum, and you take it to fatigue failure. That actually is an equally effective way of inducing hypertrophy, despite the fact that you're using 3, 5, 10, maybe most 20 to 30% of your 1 rep max. Why? Because you went through the route of metabolic disturbance. Okay. Other ways, say a higher load, maybe as heavy as you can for say 8 repetitions, is going to get through what's called mechanical tension. And so there's these different paths that we can get to the same spot. Now, eventually these things have a saturation point. So you don't need all 3 of these mechanisms. The third one, of course, being muscle damage or breakdown. And I know we want to chat a little bit about that, but none of these 3 are absolutely required. You can have multiple of them in a session. You don't have to have breakdown at all. That is a complete, really it's a flat out lie that you have to break a muscle down to cause it to grow. That's just not needed at all. You have to have one of these 3 things though. And so again, this allows you a lot of flexibility, which is why crafting your program, which is best for you, is actually fairly simple when it comes to hypertrophy. You just have to make sure you do the work. There are independent benefits that come from just endurance training, and there are independent benefits that come from strength training. And so to just give you one categorically, the way that you want to think about this is resistance exercise and strength training is the #1 tool to combat neuromuscular aging. You cannot get that through any other form of exercise besides heavy overload strength training. And we can walk through in detail what that is, but that is reason #1. In general, human movement is a function of #1, some sort of neuromuscular activation. So nerves have to turn on. The second part is muscles have to contract. And the third part is those muscles have to move a bone. All right. If you want to be alive and you want to live by yourself, you have to be able to engage in human movement. If you have any dysfunction in the neuromuscular system there, then you're not going to be able to do that. And again, as I mentioned, the only way to preserve that or fight that loss of aging is to strength train. So people will tend to hear numbers like you lose about 1% of muscle size per year after age about 40. And that's true. However, what they don't realize is you lose about 2 to 4% of your strength per year. So the loss of strength is almost double that, the loss of muscle mass with aging. Muscle power is more like 8 to 10% per year. And so we can very clearly see the problem you're going to have with aging is not going to be preservation of muscle, although that is incredibly important. It's going to be very specifically preservation of muscle power and strength. And why that really matters is your ability to, again, stand up and move, your ability to catch yourself from a fall, your ability to feel confident doing a movement. That is a function of muscle power more than it is muscle size. And so functionality is really what we want to be, right? You want to be able to do whatever you want to do physically and feel confident in doing that as you age. That's going to only be obtained through strength training.
So is it appropriate to say that training for strength and hypertrophy is also a way to keep your nervous system healthy and young?
Yeah, absolutely. It is the only exercise route we have for that. If you look at just basic numbers like motor units, you're going to see that older individuals have like a 30 to 40% reduction in total motor units.
So when you say older, approximately what ages are you referring to? Because I know many people out there, such as myself, are 40 and older, but I know many of our listeners are in their 20s, maybe even in their teens. And I can imagine that people that start doing strength and hypertrophy training younger will afford themselves an advantage over time, but that everybody should be doing strength and hypertrophy training for as much of their lifespan as possible. That's really the message that I'm getting. So if somebody is, for instance, 45, would that fall into the bin of older?
You're going to start seeing decrements past, again, around the age of 40 or so. Now, there's a lot of genetic variation there, and a lot of other things go into that equation, like your sleep and your nutrition. But that's a fair number to sort of think about. One actually response is, it's actually sort of counterintuitive. The wonderful thing about strength training is you don't actually have to start at a young age. You can actually, in fact, I was reading a paper this morning because of our previous conversation. It was in over age 90. So these are folks 90 plus, and they saw improvements like 30 to 170% in things like muscle size and hypertrophy over a very short period of time. I think it was 12 weeks. So you don't actually have to start. There are some adaptations that you're going to need for health that you God, you really need to start in your 20s. The reason I like to mention that is because if you are listening and you are 50 and you're like, oh, I haven't been strength training, you're not toast. Like, you should absolutely start now, but you're going to be able to get to a fantastic spot very quickly. Similarly, though, if you are 20 or 25 and 30 and you aren't lifting, there are still many reasons why you should do that now. And I'd like to point that out because a lot of folks will be like, oh my gosh, they said I have to do it when I'm 20 or 25, or I'll be sort of screwed. And that's not the case at all. There's really no age limit on this. In fact, there's actually interesting data that just came out showing this reduction in muscle strength and hypertrophy that I sort of talked about is basically ameliorated with a preservation of activity. In other words, you don't lose these functionalities because of aging. You lose these because of a loss of training. To state that again, you don't lose these because of some innate physiological thing that happens with genes become less sensitive or you lose functionality. You pretty much can describe the loss of function of strength and muscle in aging as exclusively because of a loss of training and nutrition and anabolic resistance and some other things. So you can do a lot more than you think when it comes to maintaining high quality muscle. And that's really important to point out.